He said, I was worried about you. I heard she had another man. I wondered how you felt about it. I'm so happy I can't stop crying. I'm so happy I'm laughing through my tears. That song was by Sting, and it describes the whole song, kind of his growth and overcoming divorce and the transgression of his mate. And while that song presented the idea of working through those emotions, I will tell you that there's probably a lot of people that the moment the gavel drops on their divorce, they're so happy they can't stop crying, unfortunately. In our culture, there are over 1 million divorces annually. That means that 1 million times people break their marriage vows, for whatever reason that may be. And 1 million times lawyers bicker back and forth about who's going to get what. And the majority of those 1 million times, there are children that are left in the wake of the destruction. All of that heartbreak and turmoil and sadness, and some still leave so happy they can't stop crying. Tears of happiness. The reason that is we live in a disposable culture. I don't know if you thought about that, but there used to be a time where you repaired everything and you never got rid of anything. And we live in a time now where it's often cheaper to discard something than fix it. Just get rid of it. Post it on Facebook Marketplace and hand that off to somebody else and go get you a new one that you're going to like better anyway. That disposable kind of mindset, I think, has drifted into marriage today as well. Yesterday, Duane and I celebrated 22 years of marriage. 22 years of wedded bliss. No problems, no fighting, no anxieties, no difficulties ever, no stress. Everything has been perfect. That's all a lie. So much a lie, Ashley Rawls got choked up about it. That's just not true. Now, I want to make clear before I move on, all of those problems and all of those issues were my fault. I want to put that over there. But the reason I say that's a lie is because that's what Hollywood tells you marriage should be like, and that's what we think. And by the way, social media has not made that much better, because in social media, what you get to see is everybody's highlight reel, the best moments of their life. And so you see all these other couples, and all they're doing is going out and having a good time, and their trips and their meals and how perfect their life looks. Nobody posts the argument online. Well, some do. And that gets you defriended today, because we don't want to see that. Because Hollywood tells you that a perfect person is out there for you. And that when you find that perfectly suited, destined mate for you, everything goes good. But now if you marry the wrong person, life is going to have all kinds of problems. And what the movies often show is in those times when marriage gets tough, what happens is it's not really your fault, it's their fault, they're the wrong person. So find somebody else who's more perfect and better suited for you. Just start over. Let me tell you a little secret about at least our marriage, why that has lasted for 22 years. Which is not as long as so many of you here. But I know our marriage has lasted because even in those tough times, we remembered, we made a commitment to love each other no matter what happened. There are times, by the way, that I'm sure it would have been easier to walk away than to stay married. But that's not the vow we made. We made a vow to love each other, to love the one we're with. And by the way, the title of this lesson does not reflect the song by the same name. Because I don't know if you realize that song that Stephen Stills wrote said, there's a rose in the fisted glove, the eagle flies with a dove, and you can't be with the one you love. Honey, love the one you're with. That song reflects the Hollywood formula. It's the disposable mentality. What I want to share with you this morning is the real idea of loving the one you're with and some reasons you do that. So number one, you should love the one you're with because, if we can get this to work here, there it is. God demands it. God demands for husbands and wives to love each other. If you go back to Ephesians chapter 5 with me, we'll start there in Ephesians chapter 5. You know this passage well. If you remember here, you've been reading this passage hopefully every week. If you're in the class back here with Joe, I think you're already past this point. In Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 25. Husbands are told, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. It's interesting here in that text that husbands are told to love their wives, and wives before that, which we didn't read, are told to submit to their husbands. But to make sure you understand that both mates have to love each other, I will remind you that in Titus chapter 2, in verses 2 through 4, older women are told to teach younger women to love their husbands. All of which means there is this expectation by God for you to love your mate. And make sure you understand that love is a decision you make. It is not an emotion. It's a decision you make to act in a certain way. It is a commitment. Vine said of this, Christian love is not an impulse from the feelings. It does not always run with the natural inclinations, nor does it spend itself only upon those for whom some affinity is discovered. Love seeks the welfare of all and works no ill to any. Love seeks the opportunity to do good. Love seeks the opportunity to do good. What does it mean to set your love upon someone? Have you ever thought about that? What does that really mean? I want you to turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, and I want you to notice that God is a terrific example of what this means. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 through 9. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you. So lost my place. From the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. God loved Israel. Why? Not because of her might. In fact, she wasn't very large when he loved her. She was the fewest. But he chose her and made her a treasured possession. He set his love upon her, it says. That's the same mentality I believe husbands and wives should have for each other. That we set our love upon each other, that we make an oath of that love, that each other is a treasured possession in that sense. And that kind of love is what Jonathan just read for us from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. The kind of love that God expects you to have for your mate is not this kind of ooey gooey, warm and fuzzy love you see on TV all the time. It is this love that is patient and kind and doesn't envy, doesn't boast. It's not arrogant, it's not rude. Doesn't insist on having its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. Doesn't rejoice when someone does wrong, but rejoices in truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now that's a different kind of love than what Hollywood will show you. It's a different kind of love than what you read in those romance novels or maybe that you see in other ways. That's a different kind of love. And that's the kind of love that God expects. Secondly, you love the one you're with because you promised that you would. We call those promises in the marriage ceremony the vows. You take a vow to love your husband, your wife. They probably went something like this. Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have, to hold from this day forward until death do you part? Do you promise to love, honor, cherish her in sickness and health, in prosperity and adversity, to keep yourself for her and her only as long as you both shall live? And then he would turn, the preacher or whoever did your ceremony would likely turn to the wife and say, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have, to hold from this day forward till death do you part? Do you promise to love, honor, obey him in sickness and health, in prosperity, adversity, to keep yourself for him and him only as long as you both shall live? What you need to understand is if you answered to that question, that line of question, or something similar, I do, that means that you made a vow before God to love your mate that way. Wait a minute, I was young. I didn't know what I was doing. I was desperate. I thought I loved him, but I didn't know who he was. You just don't know how much he's changed. The Shulamite said in Song of Solomon 2 and verse 16, my beloved is mine and I am his. There's a promise implied there. People say, well, he's not the man I thought he was. God says, love him anyway. He's yours. Well, she's changed. Love her anyway. She's yours. That's what the vows that you took and that you agreed to say. I take this man or this woman in good times and in bad times. She belongs to me. And you don't get to come back later and go, I didn't understand any of that. Because God expects you to keep that. God expects us to keep all of our vows. We're not going to read it, but there's a section in Numbers 30 where God focuses on that in the law of Moses. Keep the vows that you make. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about keeping the promises or oaths that you make. There is this undeniable kind of concept in the Scripture. You make a promise, you make a guarantee, you make a vow, you keep that. Understand, marriage is a covenant. And it's not just a covenant between you and your mate, it's a covenant between you, your mate, and God to make this covenant. Malachi 2 and verse 14, but you say, why does he not? Because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you've been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife, by covenant. The Lord is the witness to this covenant you make with your husband and with your wife. In Deuteronomy 23 and 21 through 23, it says, if you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay in fulfilling it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you'll be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from vowing it, you will not be guilty of sin. Let me tell you what that means. If you make the vow, you better keep it. If you don't think you can keep it, don't make the vow. Young people especially who are not married, let me say this to you. If you're dating, if you're engaged, but you have doubts, don't take the vow until you're certain. Don't rush into this relationship. And don't rush into a marriage because you bought a dress and you have a venue and you look forward to the pictures you're going to see. I'm going to tell you what, if you can't hold that vow, that dress and those pictures and all of those memories are going to be painful one day. You be certain you can take this vow seriously. Because when you make the vow, you have to keep it. Amen. It's a covenant. And God is going to hold us accountable for keeping the covenant. Thirdly, love the one you're with because your children deserve it. Children deserve a home of permanency and stability. A home where they see the love their parents have for each other is not always perfect, but it is constant. And that even when it is difficult, they continue to love each other. A home where commitments are honored and vows are fulfilled and kept. Children deserve those kinds of homes. The people who suffer the most from divorce when there are children is always the children. Now, I will tell you that everybody suffers, but the children suffer the most. They deserve a home that will bring them up as what Paul described, the discipline and instruction of the Lord. But can the home where the father does not love his wife or the mother does not love her husband truly be described as a home that features the discipline and instruction of the Lord? You got to understand one undeniable thing about parenting and homes and children, and that's this: if your religion doesn't work at home, it doesn't work. Your inability or your unwillingness to sustain an environment of genuine Christian faith and love in your home will be a stumbling block to your children. Fathers, your children deserve for you to be the best father to them you can be. But understand that begins by you being the best husband you can be to your wife. And wives, understand that your children deserve for you to be the best mother for them that you can be. But that begins by being the best wife that you can be. Too many homes today are what is described by so many as being child-centered. Understand this: God's path clearly shows for the home that they are not child-centered. They are first God-centered, and then they are mate-centered, and children come after that. You must love your mate more than your child, or your home is not reflecting the pattern God has laid out so clearly in places like Ephesians 5:22 through 6, verse 4. Finally, love the one you're with, or you could cause your mate to lose his or her soul. I know of a story of a family who almost fell apart. The husband had an affair. And yet, they were able to save the family. And the reason for that is that the wife forgave him, reconciled, and they're still married today. The wife was asked, "Why did you do that? Why did you take him back?" And her answer was simple: "I knew that if I divorced him, he'd go to hell. And the only way his soul could be saved, because I knew he could never survive that life, was if I took him back." What a beautiful love story that is. The understanding that my actions, even when I'm justified, and even when God says that is okay, you can do that, that action could still be a detriment to someone I love. You talk about forgoing a liberty for the sake of someone else. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said in verse 32, "Everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." That phrase there, "makes her commit adultery," should stick out to you. There is this implication by Jesus that in those cases where repentance does not occur, there is sin that persists, and that person could lose their soul. You add to that 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which is interesting to think about in the context of this conversation. In those first 5 verses, I want you to see what Paul says. "Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, likewise the wife to her husband, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps for agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Paul says there in that text, withholding that intimacy of the relationship, removing that completely, can cause such a temptation for your mate and expose them to the attacks of Satan so much that it puts their soul in danger and peril. And he says, don't do that. Think about that in regards to the idea of divorce. And if you leave your mate who is striving to be faithful, and you leave them for whatever reason that is, and they now have to face a life without that, in a permanent situation, Paul says you have put them in danger. Don't do that. If you love your husband or your wife, in fact, I would say if you have ever loved your husband or your wife, how could you ever consider acting in a way that puts their soul in danger of eternal death? Am I suggesting that you might have to, in some cases, put up with things that you think you shouldn't have to put up with just so your mate can be able to live in a way that encourages them to have eternal life? That's absolutely what I'm suggesting. And by the way, that mentality of sacrifice for the salvation of others is not just in marriage. We're supposed to feel that way about everybody. If we really love them, we would never put them in that circumstance. In Proverbs 31, there's a passage we call the virtuous woman. Probably should be better to be called it the godly woman. But in verses 11 and 12, it's interesting. It says, the heart of her husband trusts in her. He will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. He trusts in her. She does him good, not harm. I think that's a beautiful description of the idea of what marriage really should be about. You stick out the bad times. Why? Because he trusts her and she trusts him. And you both seek your mind to do good and not harm to each other. That's the idea. And that's why you love the one you're with. Because you put your trust in each other. And you seek to do good and not harm. C.S. Lewis, at the time of his writing in Mere Christianity, was not married. And yet he described marital love so well, I think, in that book. Here's what he said. What we call being in love is a glorious state, and in several ways is good for us. It is a noble feeling, but still a feeling. Ceasing to be in love need not mean ceasing to love. Love in this second sense, love as distinct from being in love, is not merely a feeling. It is a deep unity, maintained by the will and deliberately strengthened by habit, reinforced by the grace in which both parties ask and receive from God. They can have this love for each other even at these moments when they do not like each other, as you love yourself even when you do not like yourself. They can retain this love even when each would easily, if they allow themselves, be in love with someone else. Being in love first moved them to promise fidelity. This quieter love enables them to keep the promise. It is on this love that the engine of marriage is run. Being in love was the explosion that started it. How true that is. The world around us tells us, if you don't love the one you're with, go find somebody else. But God's teaching on marriage says, love the one you're with. Even in those days you don't like them very much. Even when the life you dreamed of when you were falling in love is not the life that you've inherited. Those of us that have been married for a while, you ever look back and go, how did we get here? This was not what we envisioned. I mean, I got to tell you, most of you heard this story. When we got married, Duane said, there are 5 states you cannot move me to. They all start with the letter A. And here we are. Being in love may be the explosion that starts it, but loving each other is the engine that keeps your marriage running. May God help us all to love each other. May I say to those of you that are around the room who've been married for way longer than me, thank you for your example. Your example of loving each other, and I'm sure as much as we think your marriage is perfect, it has not always been. But thank you for the example you've left for us. Love is the same motivation that God had to offer us salvation through His Son. And what an example of loving in the worst of times that is. Romans 5, 6 through 8 says that while we were still sinners, He offered that love to us. There's not a better representation of loving in the darkest of times than what God did for us by sending Jesus to die for us. If you're here this morning and you've not seized that love, that gift of love, the grace extended through you through Jesus Christ, we want you to do that this morning. Do you believe in Jesus? Because of that belief, are you willing to dedicate your life to Him, to be His disciple? Will you change your life? No longer live for yourself, but live for Him? Will you confess your faith that He is God's Son, and will you be baptized, united in His death, rise up out of that water, united in His resurrection, walking in a new spiritual walk? Resurrected in His image and shining that image to all around you. If you have not done that, we'd encourage you to do it now. Come while we stand and while we